We are live.
Welcome, everyone, to the Connected Learning TV. This is the second webinar of our July 2015 series titled Learning and Leading in a Connected World. If you're watching this, please take a moment to share it with your networks. I am Sharma, and I teach writing and rhetoric at the Stony Brook University in New York. Along with Anna Smith, I'll be your host for today. And we are excited to be speaking with Amy Stornaiuolo, Nathan Phillips, Jon Wargo, Sam Dyson, and Kim Douilliard. Before we dive into our chat, let's go over a couple of quick details. To those watching live right now, we welcome your comments and questions either via the Twitter hashtag #ConnectedLearning, and hashtag CLMOOC, or Q&A. Or the Q&A feature in the on the side of the Google On Air, Hangout On Air. If you're watching this, you might be able to see it on the right. We'll do our best to address your questions here in the Google Hangout. The webinar is also being co-streamed at National Writing Project's educatorinnovator.org. Each week throughout this session on Connected Learning TV, we're exploring themes and questions related to CLMOOC, a connected learning massively open online collaboration designed by the National Writing Project Educators and Educator Innovator. Partners as a collaborative knowledge building, sharing experience, open to anyone interested in making, playing, and learning together about connected learning. Looking forward to the conversation. Anna?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Anna Smith, and I'm currently an IES postdoctoral fellow in writing and new learning ecologies. And so this week our focus is on literacies and connected learning. So along with new technologies in this last decade, we've seen the emergence and evolution of many new ways of connecting, communicating, learning, and being literate in on and offline spaces. And so we've invited guests today whose work is focused on what I sometimes call this life-wide literacy learning of youth and adults. And so we're excited to, the format today is going to be, we're going to give each of the guests time to talk about their work at length and then discuss that together. But I want to make sure before we start that we've all been introduced. So we're going to quickly go through and have each of us share who we are, where we're joining from, and what we're bringing to why we're here at the conversation, what we're bringing to the conversation. So Amy, can you start us off?
Absolutely. Thanks, Anna. My name is Amy Stornaiuolo, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Reading, Writing, and Literacy Division. And I do a lot of work on adolescence and writing, but particularly in new media contexts, exploring socially networked ways of connecting, both through affinity spaces and then how those get integrated into school contexts.
Great. Jon?
Sure. Hi, my name is Jon Wargo. I'm a university fellow and PhD candidate here at Michigan State University, specializing in language and literacy education. Like Amy, my focus is on digital rhetorics and writing studies. And I'm really excited to be a part of this webinar today as we sort of think about mobility and movement and what that means for the future of literacy research.
Cool. Kim?
Hi, I'm Kim Douilliard, and I'm the director of the San Diego Area Writing Project that's located at the University of California, San Diego. And I'm also a classroom teacher. I teach a multi-age class of first, second, and third graders. And I'm going to be talking about a project that we've been working on here in San Diego that is a way of connecting in and out of school literacies.
Nate?
Hi, I'm Nate Phillips. I am an assistant professor in literacy, language, and culture at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And my research focuses on cultural, social, spatial, and digital geographies of literacy and learning, particularly youth learning in urban contexts. And I think about geographies both in terms of literacy and learning across time and space, as well as literacy and learning in which time and space are central phenomena. And I'm really excited to be hanging with my friends today and talking to y'all.
Great. And one of those friends is Sam D.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to join this conversation. I am the director of the Hive Chicago Learning Network, which is a Chicago-based initiative of the Mozilla Foundation and one of a growing number of cities in which Hive is providing a way for educators and youth to network with one another and to build universal web literacy, which is squarely related to today's conversation, so I'm excited.
Great. We're really excited that all of you were available at this time and we were able to make this happen. So the topic today, the title is Transliteracies, Exploring Literacies and Learning in a Connected World. And that Transliteracies, I guess, not subtitle, but title, is a term that Amy and Nate and I have started to use in thinking about our different areas of interest when it comes to education and learning and literacy. And it's kind of pointing to these contemporary new practices, ways that we're interpreting, composing, and producing literate artifacts, and the way that that has changed in the contemporary times. And so one thing I actually don't want to do today, I hope we don't do, is get hung up in talking about what a term means and in kind of the abstract, but I hope we can really dig in terms of these different projects that you're working on, how they're grounded in these lives. So the reason why we have that term at all, though, is that it's helping Amy, Nate, and I think about some particular things about literacy and learning. So one of those things is about how literacy and learning are fundamentally mobile practices, meaning that that literacy and learning are social, relational, they're distributed, they're connected, rather than being located in people's minds. Sometimes literacy is focused on a skills approach or ability approach, and we're thinking more of how our literacy practices move with us. And so that means that in our lives we're doing lots of kinds of border crossing, local borders, social borders, cultural borders, national, international. And that trans part of the transliteracies is helping us think about those types of border crossings and the ways that our lives are mobile and as we physically and virtually move. And so another aspect that it's helping us think about is that those movements are not acontextual. They're part of these larger systems of practice. And currently, the current make cycle in the Connected Learning MOOC is focused, Kim's actually leading us off, and their writing project is leading us off in that make cycle. They're focused on these systems and thinking about the systems of practice in which our lives are really embedded and our literacy is embedded. And when we start to, one of the things they talked about yesterday in the CL MOOC Make With Me Hangout was about when we start to see the systems that sometimes seem invisible, we can start to see how things like inequities or equities can be produced in these like systematic ways. And so that helps. So thinking about transliteracies and movements within systems is helping us do that. So one other thing that may not be so obvious in the term transliteracies is that that is helping us think about this is that there are materials along with people that have meaningful effect in our lives. So things like technologies and objects and media, they participate in learning and in literacy. And sometimes in our traditional ways of looking at education, the movements, the systems, and sometimes these other materials aren't given the same amount of focus in the consequences of literacy and literacy practice. And so transliteracies is helping us think about that. So now that I kind of have, that's a quick overview of some of the things that it's helping us do. I want to really actually dig into how people are thinking about and designing for these transliterate lives and experiences that we have. And then I think that these kind of these big ideas will feel more grounded as we continue to talk. So Sam D, I'm going to ask you to start us off. You've mentioned Chicago Hive, and I'd love to hear more about how that actually functions within Chicago and how you're designing for these physically, moving and issues of access and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I just want to say one of the things I really like about this term transliteracies is this aspect of motion, or the sense of motion, being able to move. I almost think of like the transcontinental railways or highways. That notion of trans suggests a freedom and ability to move and navigate. different spaces and to learn in different spaces. And that certainly resonates with the work that we're doing, which I can introduce briefly. And I'll start with the broadest frame, which is really to talk about the work that Mozilla does in supporting what we believe is the largest public resource upon which our society is expanding in an increasingly digital direction, and that free global resource is the web. And people's ability to read, write, and participate on that web is what we think of as web literacy. And web literacy, like any English literacy, is an essential component for people to be able to really not just read and not just write, but really fully participate in their digital lives and to use that resource for the means that are important for them, for attaining connection, opportunity, and so on. And so that, from the global sense, is really the connection that Mozilla has to this concept of literacy and ability to navigate freely. In a Hive context, we are really trying to mobilize a citywide network of institutions and educators who are doing work with teens that help not only build this basic level of literacy, this ability to read, write, and participate in the digital world, but who can use their skills and abilities to pursue all sorts of interests in ways that connect them socially, connect them to new opportunities, and connect them deeply to the things that they care about getting better at. And so in that context, we have this citywide community where we're trying to think about questions like how you help youth have learning experiences that actually connect across the different spheres of their life, and how you help adults design those kind of experiences and have those kind of experiences themselves. So that's a brief and broad intro to the work of the Hive and of Mozilla and how it relates to this idea both of literacy, being able to read, write, and participate in the digital world, but also this idea of transliteracy, being able to move and navigate across spaces in a citywide context, but also in a learning context in different learning spaces.
So I know that I have some questions around how you're thinking about that designing for these transliterate lives. But I also want all of our guests today to feel free to dive in with their questions too. We want to talk about in depth about this. So I'll start you off with one of my questions, and then I'll let other people dive in as well. So one question I have is then, so what are some of the moves that you try to make in terms of designing for these for youth who are moving among several different contexts, like, right? So in a day within a city, you're going from, I'm guessing like a transportation system to, you're moving from that into a school system, into, an informal space. Maybe you're picking up something at Mickey D's, and then you're moving into and maybe perhaps an out-of-school space or an extracurricular or community space. And you were talking about designing for that, like, across those spaces. So what are some of the things that you guys are thinking about in terms of designing for that?
Yeah, I think the first key piece is that I guess the thing that allows us to connect most directly to youth, the hook, the point of engagement, really is around youth interests. And it doesn't have to be interests that youth come in the door having, but it could be interests that get cultivated anew through new experiences and opportunities, and that those interests become a bridging mechanism that allow movement of learners across otherwise separate spaces of learning. For example, if young people are empowered to develop their voice to speak, speak their truth about a particular issue that matters to them. Their voice can be expressed across a variety of contexts in a variety of ways. It could be expressed through being able to create a podcast, for example, or being able to create a video that expresses a certain idea, or being able to engage with a community of conversation online, or being able to take their opinion and passion into a school space and create a persuasive writing piece. That interest is the thing that helps bridge across those different spaces. And I think that's one of the things that we want to, as a design principle, we want to definitely make sure that what we're developing for young people connects directly to their interests and allows those interests in across a variety of modes and medium. But you also mentioned just the sort of physical space, the idea of being able to move in physical space and time, and that's something that we're also trying to create ways to design for, whether that means developing apps that young people can use to better navigate physical space of the city, to be able to have youth-centered ride-sharing opportunities, or just to be able to find peers who are leaving from their school, going to a particular museum, for example, that a kid might be uncomfortable attending on their own. So I guess I'll leave it at that as some considerations that we're making. I'd be curious to hear what other people have to say as well.
Can I ask a quick question? When you brought up this issue of transcending and traveling and movement, something that has struck me in recent days, I read an article about the Greek referendum on joining or leaving the euro and accepting, not accepting the terms of the austerity measures. An author in I think Al Jazeera wrote that there are two types of people: one that is connected to the rest of the world, global, cosmopolitan, who doesn't care about the nation and local economy and the rest of their fellow neighbors and fellow country folks, citizens. And the other group is the people that are really good, right? So they cast this people that are connected transnationally as the cosmopolitan, selfish, greedy, whatever. And I was amazed because on the one hand, we're seeing this ability of the adult communities who don't go to college are being connected to the rest of the world. We see young college students, we see high school and school students that are connected to the rest of the world. So we see transliteracies as a means of transcending those barriers. And transliteracy is also seen as dubbed as that, the elite thing only done by the few that are connected, that leaves out the rest of our communities. What's your observation on that kind of potential backlash or the sort of traditional stereotypical view of the connected and the networked?
Yeah, I think that for me underscores the importance of the word universal in universal web literacy that we think about in the Mozilla context. That there are going to be a bunch of people coming online and having increasingly digital lives. When I say a bunch, I mean billions over the next several years. And a lot of them who are actually even using the internet, whether it's on their phone or on a computer, don't actually know that they're using the internet, don't know that they can, that it's not just as Chris Lawrence said at the Digital Media and Learning Conference, it's not just a sexier TV, a different way of consuming, but it's actually something they can shape and transform and mold. And I think being able to make that ability to fully read, write, and participate something that's a universal right, as universal as it is to speak, read, write, and participate in other ways, that's something I think we need to set as a high standard for all, and not just for those who have the privilege, and not just the privilege, but also the sense of agency that this should be their right.
Thank you. That's an important point.
Well, kind of connected to that, Sam, I had a question as well, and I'm going to try and connect this into the last point about this kind of disjuncture between the cosmopolitan, connected person and the kind of locally rooted citizen, which is connected to your point about youth interests. I'm really fascinated about how kind of putting youth interests at the center and then letting the young people you work with kind of build out from there and use that to navigate these different contexts and spaces. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the youth voices get taken up in these different spaces. So, for example, one of the things I'm really interested about, and if we have time later I'll mention it, is about a project about ways to further connect these young people to each other who are doing this work in different spaces. And so I'm wondering if, in some ways, as we work towards a universal web literacy and more people kind of engage in this, how do youth get heard in that space and don't just get lost in the noise? In other words, how can we amplify those youth voices?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that we're trying to explore this is by asking not just how do we amplify youth voice, but how do we engage youth in building the tools that are informed and shaped by their voice. So to give an example, one of the Hive Chicago members is the Adler Planetarium, and it has been running a series of hack events where young people, educators, and technologists come together to develop technical solutions, whether they be apps or websites, that help address a particular issue that youth bring to the table, so that the tool doesn't simply become a way of broadcasting a voice, but it becomes a designed element that's informed by youth input. The Hack Day is one model for doing this, and it's connected to the National Day of Civic Hacking that the White House has supported. One specific output, not from an Adler hack experience, but from another civic hacking effort here in Chicago, is an app that's still under development called Ride With Me. That is, I alluded to earlier, it came out of input from educators through a process in Chicago that we call moonshots, which are calls to action around shared issues like transportation, and young people who gave input to the challenges and helped design an app that helps connect young people to each other traveling to take advantage of program opportunities. It makes the program opportunities visible and also makes peer connection visible. So that's an example where youth input is not just being broadcast, like here are the things kids are saying, but here is how the things they're saying are shaping the design of the tools that they are empowered to co-create.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful, expansive view of voice, right? And what voice it can do, not just can say. And I think that's a beautiful transition into Jon's work.
Yeah.
And yeah, were you thinking about the same thing, Sam? So, Jon, can you talk to us about the work that you've done with young people, their practices that they've been engaging in, and their mobile literacies?
Sure. Yeah, and I think it echoes one of Sam D's sort of comments around, I was really interested in the ways in which youth were using mobile media to amplify their voice and write with mobile media to sort of design more just social futures for whatever reason, or whatever that looked like for them. So I did a 30-month connective ethnographic study with 6 LGBT and queer youth in mid-Michigan, and we sort of did a lot of work around sort of thinking about the ways in which they were orchestrating queer identity, engaging civically, but also understanding how they were connecting communities both online and offline, and navigating inequality. Navigating is another theme that sort of emerges here when we think about transliteracy work. So at first we looked at Tumblr because this was sort of a cited space that was very sort of queer oriented. It was one in which they felt was very sort of responsive to race issues. The bulk of my participants are African American, so they quote unquote felt black in this Tumblr space that they were a part of. And so the practices that first emerged were pretty typical of what the affordances of tumbling are. You blog photo posts, you reblog, you sort of tag visual literacies, you sort of write diary-like, personal-based posts. And as a researcher and as an English educator, I was really interested in thinking about, okay, sure, we can look at these sort of individual posts and practices as semiotic laminations almost, but what does the larger picture sort of say? And so I sat down with youth and we used Dippity, which is a web-based tool that you can use to sort of collect RSS feeds and break it down algorithmically to think about trends or themes that emerge. And we thought about, what does this say about identity? What does this say about my practice? And this led me to sort of think about youth live streaming as a practice. So live streaming is sort of the rhetorical act of streaming documents, pictures, posts, text, visuals to sort of curate an imagined or real self to either a networked audience or sort of in real life audience. And typically people like to think about live streaming with big data. So like a social media company may look at, what are sort of the users thinking about this particular tag, what's trending, but we used it to sort of think about what types of narratives youth were producing through these particular practices. And so obviously as the study grew, Tumblr became one of many sightings that we were interested in looking at. So outside of youth live streaming, one participant was really interested in thinking about mobility and movement using Snapchat. And so live streaming was one practice that led me to thinking about how youth are becoming narrative cartographers, or thinking about documenting the movement through space with mobile media. And so outside of those particular practices, this sort of led me to think about the ways in which youth are not necessarily just thinking about mobile media as a representational resource, but how they are sort of engaging with mobile media to create an experience, to architect and design an experience for an audience. And Snapchat, I think is at the zenith of its popularity right now, and I think that is really interesting to consider because through Snapchat, you sort of, create what this, desired experience would look like for a select group of people. So in a recent article, I sort of talked a little bit about Ben, who had a really interesting way of snapping. He used the geolocation services on his mobile phone to open up Google Maps and to drop pins wherever he snapped. He then sort of used this map as an overlay to Snapchat and talked a lot about the ways in which place was a resource and an active participant in the stories that he told. And I think that this connects to a lot of some of the work Sam D was talking about, is or the question you first asked, Anna, is that as sort of youth are navigating through these institutional discourses, through space and place, the different sort of narratives they compose are of course they're responsive to space. Space is an active participant. And so I guess another one that I'll sort of briefly talk to before we sort of step back a little bit is I had a participant, Zeke, who used StoryMap and Instagram and his phone to document what it meant to feel black and queer in this mid-Michigan city. And he sort of used the sort of Instagram geolocation feature to sort of collect and map the last 20 spots he was at on StoryMap, and he included ambient sound of what it sounded like. So what does it sound to be in this community garden? What does it sound to be sitting on this bed, playing cards with my best friend Camille? What does it sound like to be in my English classroom as we talk about a text who, under his breath, says, this has nothing, to do with me? I think that's really interesting, the way that it's almost a counter-narrative, right? There's a counter-narrative that's being produced through mobile media that oftentimes we think about as an affordance to the classroom, but not necessarily as a parallel or connective narrative to what is happening. But I'll stop there just for time, but I'm excited about this.
So Kim, do you want to follow up? Does anyone want to follow up on what John was discussing?
Yeah, I've got a question, John. I love those examples, and something that we've done in my work is really try and introduce tools like this and efforts to do use geospatial technologies to sort of both understand the world and then make change. What seems particularly cool about your example, and what I hope you can share a little bit more, is it sounds like these were practices that you didn't kind of teach or introduce, that these were young people identifying tools, developing for themselves ways that they wanted to participate in the world, share their stories. Have they talked about what their processes were like for identifying tools in that way, and how you've come to think about the design element? Like, is there a way to take these youth practices and teach or build resources so that other youth can have these same kind of opportunities to engage in the world in these ways that might be unavailable without sort of a knowledge of the technology and or the idea to use them in this way?
Yeah, I think that originally it sort of started with, as Snapchat grew in popularity, one of the elements that was added to the application was the live snap. So Snapchat would sort of collect streams of like an event like Wimbledon, or a political movement like the Je suis Charlie movement. And a lot of the questions that the youth were bringing to me and the larger group, the teacher that I work with, were, well, but no one's going to focus on, this city. No one's going to create sort of a collective imaginary of what our day-to-day looks like. And so like I was like, oh yeah, but like, I saw some teachers do these like QR codes where like you snapped it in your phone and it sort of gave these messages. And that's when they really taught me about some of the tools they were already using, like Snapchat. Well, we could create a Snap story, or Story Map was something that I saw a lot of digital humanities folks use, or that people used as taglines in newspaper articles, but I didn't necessarily think about the rhetorical affordances of using Story Map to listen to what space sounds like. That for me was like, what? But I also think too, when they sort of presented this to the teacher, the teacher that I work with is a 9th grade teacher. She talked about the affordances of what it would mean to be a community member, but to be an educator, listening to her students' experiences outside of the classroom, and this was one of the ways in which she was able to do that. So that's one of the things that I'm really interested in moving forward, and interested obviously to sort of think about, with the other sort of respondents and people here.
So I actually, before we move on too, I have another question, because we're talking about movement, but some of that movement is often, there's some boundaries and barriers sometimes to it's not like free movement, right? Open and free is not open and free. It's very much issues of navigation, negotiation, like Sandy was bringing up earlier. Did you see any examples of that where practices collided, or that they used these particular practices to overcome some barriers that they felt they had to be able to tell some of their stories, or how did that work?
Yeah, I think one of the things, just very quickly, is two things. One, in terms of access. So it's interesting to sort of think about in a 24-hour period where the practices stop. So some of these kids don't have reliable Wi-Fi or internet at home, but they will sort of tweet, reblog, post, create Snap stories on their break at Little Caesars, or in the classroom space where they know the Wi-Fi. And so it's interesting to think about access in terms of that, because with mobile media and with a cell phone in particular, the data plan isn't something that they all can afford. So that, I think, is terms of thinking about equity and access there. But I also think that a lot of the work that I saw youth do were in response to larger movements that they felt disconnected from. So there was nothing really done here regarding the Black Lives Matter movement outside of the university sort of rallies and movements, and they felt disconnected from that because they weren't a part of the university. And so they asked, like, well, why isn't our city doing anything about this? And for them, it was about leveraging a national discourse that let them to be a part of a community that they felt didn't exist for them locally, which again, sort of thinking about the themes of like local and global and the glocal and how those matter. But those are just two small examples.
So one really quick, just kind of follow-up comment, John, and this connects with what Sam talked about too. I realized even in asking my question, I come with this, or I was reminded in your response that we're really learning so much from youth about these practices.
Yeah.
And I take this educator stance all the time, or thinking like I've got to be teaching somebody, and really in both kind of Sam's description of what we need to do in some ways is get out of the way or make spaces or pathways or opportunities for youth to teach us. And that just really came across, I think, in what you're talking about, that sort of eye-opening moment of realizing sound, for example, could be a piece of documenting space. And so I just really appreciated that, and I think that's something for all of us to really be thinking about.
Absolutely.
That what we need to do in some ways is open up pathways for ourselves to get out of the way and to learn.
Yeah.
Sam D, did you want to add something to that? I thought.
No.
Oh, okay. So I guess we are ready to go to the next guest. I noticed a question on Twitter that said, how can we apply transliteracies to elementary-aged students, such as K to 4, in this country at least, it's K to 4. Kim, will you share with us your work in rethinking classroom learning and field trips? I know that you've been thinking about the learning of teachers, museum educators, and youth simultaneously. Can you share how you've been thinking across these scales of learning and concentric circles?
Well, that's a really big question. I'll start by just telling you a little bit about the project we've been doing here in San Diego. We've been, the San Diego Area Writing Project's been in partnership with the San Diego Natural History Museum and the Reuben H. Fleet Science Center. And in that partnership, we decided that we wanted to look at this idea of the field trip. And there's this sense that, when we think about connected learning and we think about public school classrooms, connected, they're not always connected. They're often isolated and isolating places. And so this idea of connecting what happens in classrooms to what happens outside of classrooms becomes even more important. So a group of formal educators, classroom teachers, and a group of informal educators, educators who work at museums, got together to consider how can we take this sort of iconic practice of a field trip and improve it in a way that gives students more agency and more control of their own learning and helps them make connections both to their own interests but also to learning that happens in spaces outside of classrooms. I think a lot of times students, especially at the young age, think that they're learning when they're in school and they're not learning when they're out of school. And we all know that that's not true, that we're all learning all the time in all the spaces, but kids don't always have control over that. And one of the things that we learned is that field trips tend to be one of two options in a lot of cases. It's either a free day, which means no learning expected at all. It's just an outing, fun, run wild, have a great time. Teachers aren't teaching, students aren't learning. It's a play day kind of thing. Or it's a highly structured replication of the classroom, often with clipboards, worksheets, pencils, go through, find this information, write it down kind of thing. And we really wanted to sort of bust that paradigm and consider what it might look like to have a field trip where students actually focused on what interested them and took information from museums back to their classrooms and considered ways to then continue their learning and share their learning with others, both inside and outside the classroom spaces. And so that question about young kids actually came into play in this setting. And in fact, there were students from first grade through, we actually had first grade through high school, but a lot of the learning that we focused on was in the elementary grades. And kids figuring out what it meant to be in charge of their own learning. And it did mean this large learning curve for both students and teachers. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the highlights of the work that we did was we asked the educators what they were creating tools, whether they were tangible or intangible tools, for so the support of this field trip experience, trying to turn towards a inquiry-based experience. But it was in the serving as researchers of their own tools that they learned the most. So this idea that once they developed a tool, they then would watch a very real field trip in action and observe what students, teachers, and chaperones were doing with the tools that they developed. And the results were eye-opening. And this idea of systems, like how do you change a system? Field trips are so frozen in so many ways. They've been around a long time, and they tend to be replicated over and over again in the same ways. How do you change that? And having educators actually watch what students are doing and realize that they're not having the desired result had a profound impact on how this group of educators began to see what they wanted and how to achieve those results with students. I can stop there and you can ask a question or send me in a different direction.
Kim, I had a question for you. The question that came from Twitter about how elementary school teachers and educators could apply this idea of transliteracies. The thing that came to mind for me was really the important shift from thinking about educating or teaching as the act of transmitting information to thinking about it as designing and facilitating experiences. And a field trip is really an experience, and I just wonder how what you've observed with educators in the field trip based experiences that you're trying to design for them, how you see your work helping them shift their lens from just conveying information, transmitting information, to actually designing an experience where young people can be creators and not just consumers.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And one of the teachers who we worked with really comes to mind in this, because she talks about this experience that we have done this work over the course of 2 years. And she says that participating in this experience not only improved field trips in her classroom, but it made her a better teacher. And she says it made her a better person. And so the idea that really looking carefully at students and what kind of learning experiences they have when you're not the person who's interacting intimately with the kids and not feeling like, okay, it's all about me and how much I'm transmitting to kids, but it's about what are students bringing to the experience and how do students interact with opportunities to learn in ways that are rich and layered. So she talked about how it changed her classroom practice after she took her students on 2 field trips over the course of 2 years and continued to see that she needed to get out of their way, just like you're saying, that she needed to have these experiences for kids to learn rather than directly sort of inputting information into their heads. So it's profoundly a profound experience for people who have participated with us.
Yeah, Kim, that's where my question comes in too, is thinking about how, the learnings from rendering the experience of a field trip, how that sort of transpired into a different process of what teaching looks like in the formal setting of the classroom. Like, are there any concrete examples or explicit understandings that teachers cited that's changed?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones was really moving away from the idea of documenting, I'm going to put my little air quotes up, documenting learning within the course of the field trip, right? And so I think there's so much pressure on teachers to prove that the field trip was educational, that it was worth the money, it was worth the time, it was worth being out of the classroom, that they moved to this default mode of documenting that students have learned by having them fill out a worksheet or some, even if an open-ended worksheet, it's still a worksheet nonetheless. And it's this move away from it when they realize that often what students learn isn't seen in the moment. It isn't actually, you can't even know it in the course of the field trip experience. It's when you go back to the classroom and you open up spaces for continued research, for continued collaboration, for continued connections outside of the classroom when students are producing ways to share their learning that are not necessarily like one size fits all, like you have to write an essay or you have to write a research report or you have, I mean, the you have to start to move out, and there's a lot more choice involved, that you can see that students are learning and are showing their interests and their strengths in ways that you might not have imagined. But one of the questions I feel like we're still left with is this idea of the tension between that documentation of learning that teachers are expected to do and the ability to trust learners. I think trusting learners is a really big piece of this.
Does anyone want to follow up? I could. Okay. I really am fascinated by the many different dimensions that we are exploring of this particular topic, from LGBT communities, youth to youth in the city, to college, to elementary school. I'm trying to introduce a very different dimension of this that we talked about last session, and I think we'll be talking about more in the future, especially the final one. But I am part of the college-level writing community in the United States, and in that community we've been talking about transnational writing. There is an emerging the group of socially networked scholars who are from around the world who are working here, and also scholars here who are interested in the global landscape of writing and communication and literacies. And while we haven't really connected to the elementary K-12 system or the community outside very much, I think this is the move that we need to make in the future. But at the college level writing discussions, we are interested in how students transcend national cultural borders with literacy. So in that transnational writing project, we're now looking at how our traditional frameworks, paradigms, are limited by geopolitical and national borders, so that when we say audience or purpose or context, we only mean audience, context, purpose within a particular geopolitical and cultural rhetorical tradition. But these things need to shift paradigms. For example, if I'm teaching my students and teaching about audience and context and purpose here in the United States, that may be very different from saying audience appropriateness or context appropriateness in very vastly different contexts. But because we are connected to the world, sometimes the borders and the barriers become invisible, and we don't realize how quickly we're trying to talk to the world on our own terms, not realizing that other people, other communities around the world will have to either embrace our frameworks, our frames of reference, pretend to embrace. Post-colonial theory for a long time has educated us about hybridity and mimicry. It is fascinating how we have forgotten. I think the community now, the scholars in the Western Hemisphere, has forgotten those things like the mimicry and the hybridity and the difficulties of transcending borders. And I think we need to bring that back, as I was saying the other day, bring back the challenges and the politics and the power dynamics when we try to transcend borders. And I think it's interesting how we have connected all these dots from grade school, elementary school to LGBT communities to city youth, adults and youths in the city. I'd be interested to hear what you all think about the transcending borders as a function of transliteracies.
I'm wondering if I can respond to that, because Sam, I think that the project that I'm just launching now, we're in the pilot phase, is building on some prior work that I've done with a bunch of colleagues, most principally Glinda Hull, and in this new project also with Matt Hall. And we just launched it this week, actually, and it's called Write for Change. And it does exactly that. It's creating an online global writing community, so connecting youth who are interested in writing for social change across these national borders, and thinking about exactly what you're describing, which is how do we understand the writing kind of tropes, right? Writing around audience, purpose, context when we are writing transnationally, and what does that look like? And for adolescent writers and their teachers, so they're connected specifically through teachers. And right now we're starting with some National Writing Project sites, and we're really looking to kind of expand that internationally. So we have several sites that are coming on board in fall when school kind of ramps back up. So I think that that's a question I'm very interested in, is thinking about how this kind of transliteracies lens helps us understand those different kinds of mobilities across transnational borders. So I think that's a great question.
In the design of that project, have you thought about the difficulties of the framing and the paradigm? On what basis do the folks here and folks elsewhere connect to each other? And on what basis do they transcend, and how do they make it? The tension for me in my mind is like you cannot make the understanding and learning of communication and rhetoric effective without really grounding yourself in the particular context. You can't say I am a floating international person anchored to nowhere. You have to be anchored somewhere, right? At least for the sake of your audience, for the sake of the effectiveness of your project learning and teaching. But how do you design? To go all the way back to what Sam was talking about, designing things into the project, how do you address these difficulties and the tension?
You know, one thing, because we're running out of time here too, that someone asked in the Q&A where if Kim had her results of her projects written up anywhere. And she's in the process of it, I know, of writing up her results. And so one thing in kind of an answer to your question, Sam, is that one thing I would definitely point you to is some of Amy's work. She's really grappled with this, the ethical dimensions that are part of our reading and writing and our interaction now through these literate exchanges, and some of those have to do with attitudinal and dispositional positioning and stances that we take when we read something from one particular nation state or culture, right, or and the languaging that we use. And so it's really great, deep projects that Amy has, and I would say that for each of your work. So Sam and Sean and Kim, that's another source to point to. And for the sake of time too, I wanted to also give. We wanted to give Amy and Nate both time to talk a little bit about the projects and talk about questions or things that are stretching across what they've heard today. And so we'll turn to Nate real quick.
Yes, please. I was thinking how quickly we ran from the bottom of the hour to the top.
So I'll kind of ask a question and in the question share just a brief piece of one project I think connects up to what we've been talking about. So one theme, I'd say kind of across the conversation, that I think points to work that we're all doing and then also sort of haven't talked much about at the level of how you do it, is documenting the kinds of learning and literacies that are taking place in these ways. So this is something that Amy and Anna and I have talked about quite a bit, that transliteracies is not only a framework on sort of thinking about contemporary practices, but it's an effort to analyze those practices. And what sort of tools and methods and ways do we have of analyzing practices that are mobile and transnational, cross borders, virtual, physical, in all the ways that we've been discussing. And so that's something I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about, but I'd love to open it up to the panel to think about. And we have different takes on this. So from the research perspective, that's one thing. But I think for me, and this, I'll just share briefly one effort that I've been at, something that's been really powerful as a member of the Hive Chicago Network is to connect up with other organizations to do some cross-disciplinary work in thinking about this very effort to document learning and to document literacies in these connected ways. So with the Chicago History Museum, and this connection is straight from Hive. We wouldn't have known about each other without one of the Hive staff sort of doing some matchmaking, which he's really good at. And the effort that we've been working on together is to think about young people's learning lives across time and space, and adults, as they sort of interact and intersect with the doing of history and learning and thinking about history inside the museum. And we've done kind of multiple efforts to sort of document learning across time and space. And some of this goes back, shout out to my graduate colleagues at Vanderbilt, my grad school colleagues and advisors there who really formulated this work for me. But efforts at documenting that include tools and resources that we have. So for example, using a cell phone to take a picture at 10 random times through the day as a way to think about what does learning look like for me when I'm prompted to do that and pay attention to where I am, what are the time spaces of my own sort of day learning process, and then what are the sort of temporal and spatial scales of learning within disciplines or across our lives. So that's one very small piece of lots of work, and with the Chicago History Museum, with the colleagues there, we've started calling one of our efforts GeoConvos, and you can check that out at geoconvos.org, which is just a way to sort of think about these methods for documenting the kinds of things we're talking about. And so I don't know, Anna, if this is a question for all of us to take up. We don't have much time, but leave that as something that I think we're all sort of working at and thinking about, and building these tools together is really important.
Yeah, I think that that's how we'll have to connect this, is that this will be a real transliterate practice for us, that this call is just one point in this larger conversation, and we can continue those conversations as we move forward. And one thing I would really appreciate too, Nate, that you brought up, and that was a thread throughout, but that we don't often talk about, is this thing around time and temporalities, and how we learn and our literacies, something that's come up in each of your projects as you've talked about it. Things like bordering out the classroom space as a time for learning, and everything else called informal, when really what Kim was talking about is that it's this across time that she's seeing learning happening. Jon brought up the same thing around geospatial and time, right? It was like time spaces and the Snapchats, and so I've heard that in each of your pieces, and it's something that I want to continue thinking about and talking about as part of my research as I look at how people develop as writers across time and spaces. So that's something that I hope also continues as the conversation continues and stops for now in this particular format, but then transitions to another format, another space. So there will be a full video recording of this webinar available immediately on www.connectedlearning.tv with other curated content that has happened in the Q&A piece and on Twitter. And so this wraps up the second webinar of this July 2015 series on themes related to the Connected Learning MOOC, which is the CL MOOC that's happening now. So please feel free to keep the energy going and these conversations going with the hashtags hashtag Connected Learning and hashtag CLMOOC. CLMOOC. And if you found this conversation helpful, please share it with your networks. As you can see, that we're really learning from each other, and we're engaged in trying to figure out how we make sense of this. And so your comments and tweets are really helpful in terms of thinking about that. One of the tweets that came up in just the last few minutes is also bringing up, Chris Rogers brought it up, about how sometimes our language practices and our literacy practices were also meant and built to divide us and to keep us separated and to create little enclaves of identity and group identity. And how do we make sense of that along with these literacies and languages that cross? So those are ways that really help. So if you continue these conversations, please do. It helps us thinking through it. So if you'd like to know more about the upcoming webinars from Connected Learning TV in 2015, you can visit the connectedlearning.tv website and sign up for an email newsletter. And also on Ed Innovator, you can also sign up to do that. So thanks again to everyone, and we're looking forward to this, the rest of the series this month.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for the conversation, and thank you those colleagues who are joining from the from online to listen to this conversation. And we look forward to talking to you again the next two sessions of this series in July.